Hello everybody. I'm Gia Jandieri from the Economic School. I'm only moderating this very interesting panel, which is about the role of entrepreneurs in the times of entrepreneurs and their creative and innovative characteristics in the times of the crisis. So we have great people in our panel. But before we start with the panel, I want to give chance Tamta Mikaberidze. She is the Dean of the Business Faculty at the SabaUni University, which is kind of co-hosting our meeting. We had two free market roadshows with that university with Tamta. So we were going to have it with that university. So, but now we invited Tamta University and their students to take part in this free market roadshow, which is just electronic way. So, but to make it short, Tamta, please make a greetings. We don't hear your voice. Please push on the microphone.
Hello. Thank you. I'm pleased to greet you. It's a great honor for me to join this extremely important and interesting conference today, Free Market Roadshow 2020. Conference is being hosted for the second time by the Faculty of Business and Tourism of Sultan Saba Orbeliani University. Taking into consideration the results of the corona pandemic, we are meeting each other online in a slightly more unfamiliar environment this year. So the first topic and issue in the world is coronavirus, which has been renamed 3 times, and today it's referred to as COVID-19. We would not ignore this issue, and we held a number of conferences, panel discussions and disputes at the faculty online as well, where we touched upon the current processes in the world and in Georgia in terms of economy, business, tourism, employment, investments, etc. Today, together with the New Economic School, Georgia, we're hosting the Free Market Roadshow, the topic of which is the role of entrepreneurship and innovation in times of crisis. So today, the main question around the world is, where is the economy heading in the current situation? How effective are the policy responses being deployed? What priorities and principles should guide actions by public and private sector leaders in response to the unfolding economic crisis? Following the post-COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to plan effective ways and measures to restore the world. Delays and breakdowns caused by coronavirus at this time requires the changes in the normal course of action. In such a constantly changing, turbulent environment, it's very important. And
hello?
Hello? Tamta was cut. I don't know what's happening. So there is no restoration of the connection, maybe. So we have 4 panelists here. I don't know if we reconnect with Tamta. She will be available for at the end of the conference as well. So it's better to continue with John Chisholm, which is an entrepreneur, and everybody who are interested to have more information about our speakers. I think we published all the information in our advertisement. And so, John, please start your presentation. Then we can move to Dan Mitchell and then Pierre, Garello, and Philip, please.
Gia, thanks so much for having me. It's a thrill to be here. I wish we were really in Georgia, as we've been in prior free market roadshows, but this is the next best thing. So thanks for having me. I'm in Silicon Valley. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I often get asked, is a pandemic a good time or a bad time to try to start a company? The fact is, it's a very good time. Let me give you 2 main reasons. Number 1, we don't have our usual day-to-day interruptions of meetings and so forth. We can't travel. And so it's a particularly good time to identify a customer need that you could potentially serve, reach out to prospective customers for that customer need, validate or reject your assumptions about that need, and also investigate the technologies, components, materials, and other elements of the solution that you might be able to provide for that need. So it's a great opportunity from that standpoint. What are your enemies? Your enemies are whatever might distract you from this task. Those are things probably like social media, Netflix, and video games. This pandemic, for me, has been a hugely productive time. I've gotten edits to a book I wrote that's coming out in paperback in September to my publisher. I don't have a TV. I don't play video games. So you can do the same. You can enjoy the same productivity. Secondly, and most importantly, a pandemic creates new human and customer needs that you can potentially serve. During this crisis, for example, as you well know, people need to connect with friends and family, even though they can't travel. They need to work out and stay in shape, even though they can't go to the gym. They need to get food and supplies delivered. They need to work remotely effectively, and so on and so on. Some of these needs will end with the lockdowns, when the lockdowns need, but other needs will continue indefinitely as we adopt new lifestyles. And as an entrepreneur, your job is to figure out not just which needs you can best address and how you can bring an advantage to them, but also how long the needs are going to last. So it's a complex calculation. It takes a lot of talking to many people, weighing a lot of data, and taking some risk. But the longer you keep asking questions, the clearer the picture becomes, and you can do it. So now is a really good time to start a business. What is the most important policy, public policy for addressing the pandemic? In my view, it is relaxing government regulation. It's impossible to predict where the new opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation are going to take place. If it were possible, those innovations would already have happened. And so every time there's a regulation that precludes the possibility of starting a new business or innovating along some dimension of human activity. Let me give you 4 examples of areas where regulation has been relaxed within the United States, at least, in response to the pandemic, with no negative consequences. Restaurants doing takeout. Prior to the pandemic, restaurants had to have special licenses to do takeout. Those regulations have been eliminated. Doctors having virtual appointments with patients online. Those were either precluded or had to be approved separately or had to be charged differently. All of those, many of those constraints have been eliminated, allowing more people to get health care now. The use of scooters in cities. Prior to this, many cities didn't allow scooters. Of course, scooters are a good way to get around in a pandemic in an urban environment so that you're isolated from other people. Those have been relaxed. Again, no negative consequences by relaxing these regulations. And interstate shipping and trucking. Many of those, or some of those regulations have been relaxed, again, with no negative consequences. All of these were regulations which should never have existed in the first place. So the lowest hanging fruit for recovery, in my view, is going through all our hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations and seeing how many of them we can take this opportune time to eliminate. Those are some thoughts.
Okay, so I think we can collect some questions, but I know John should go quicker, but the same is with Dan Mitchell. So Dan, please continue this, and then maybe we collect some questions for you who are living earlier. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Gia. And by the way, I'm wearing my shirt with Georgia on it in special recognition of speaking to people in Georgia. What I want to do is give a short presentation about a different aspect of economic policy that could facilitate entrepreneurship and innovation. And let me go ahead and pull up a PowerPoint screen, PowerPoint presentation that I have here, and walk through what I think are some of the factors that will be important moving forward. And first, let's sort of set out where we are right now. In many countries, there is deep economic damage. That, of course, is causing big fiscal problems. But it's this bottom part of the screen that I really want to focus on, which is in the absence of a very effective vaccine or treatment regimen, we're going to have some long-run damage to different sectors of the economy. And this is a version of creative destruction. We normally think of Joseph Schumpeter and creative destruction as a new technology that disrupts existing processes. The electric light bulb, changing the candle making industry, the personal computer, changing the typewriter industry. Well, this is creative destruction, but caused by a virus. And it's going to have specific sectoral effects on some parts of the economy. And I listed just a couple of them: airlines, tourism, lodging, entertainment, dining. These are all things that are going to be adversely affected. And what this is doing, the existing allocation of labor and capital in the economy that 6 months ago maybe was profitable and efficient, that's no longer the case. And so what we have to do is figure out, how do we allow and enable the economy, the allocation of labor and capital in the economy? How do we facilitate the quickest and most efficient and most productive sort of adaptation to these new circumstances that we're in? And it's very important to understand, government maybe can replace our income, at least in the short run. However, at some point, we need to be concerned about the generation of income. After all, politicians can only redistribute something that other people have earned in the private sector in the first place. And this is where, of course, the entrepreneurship and innovation become so important, because as I told Gia in an earlier meeting we had, I think the best policies for the current situation are the policies that have been good all the time, which are free markets and limited government. We want entrepreneurs and innovators to have the freedom, the flexibility, and John Chisholm just talked about how regulation hinders that flexibility, and we've had a little bit of good news, at least in the US, in that regulations have been relaxed. Well, we need to have more relaxation. We need the private sector, the entrepreneurs and innovators, to have more breathing room, because we have a situation where it's economically very important to try to get labor and capital reallocated in ways that are going to be productive and efficient for the economy. And let me talk about this now in the context of Georgia. Well, the good news is that Georgia has earned relatively high scores for economic liberty, although there are some areas that need improvement. And of course, we're always worried that there are areas where politicians will move policy in the wrong direction. But let me show you Georgia's latest scores from the Fraser Institute. The Fraser Institute publishes Economic Freedom of the World. And you see that Georgia is 12th in the world, which is good news. However, where is Georgia weak? Well, the lowest score that Georgia gets in terms of on a scale of 0 to 10 is legal system and property rights. And now let's look at the Heritage Foundation. Again, Georgia is ranked number 12, so an exact similar score. But where is Georgia not doing as well? Well, it's in the rule of law category. The only areas where Georgia wasn't 70 and above in every category is in that area. So what can we say about where Georgia needs to improve? Well, one area I sometimes like to look at, and I don't think it gets enough attention from all of us, are the governance indicators from the World Bank. And there are 6 of them, but I think there are 4 that are especially important for economic policy: government effectiveness, control of corruption, regulatory quality, and the rule of law. And what these things basically measure is the quality of governance in a country honest, effective, streamlined, fair, neutral, all the things that we want if we want government to be a quiet arbiter and rule maker in the background, but not trying to control the economy and not trying to tip the scales one way or the other for different sectors or different businesses for people that are connected to the politicians. Let's look at the World Bank governance indicators for these 4 areas beginning in 1996. And you can see that Georgia has improved over time. But again, let's remember, according to the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation, this is still the area where Georgia probably needs the most improvement when looking at different types of economic policy. And I'll go ahead and I'll close by giving a comparison. You can see here on your screen how Georgia's doing over time. Let's now look at Switzerland. You can see that Switzerland averages over 95% on all these different categories. So that's really the benchmark that I think that Georgia should strive for. What can you do to in effect, make government something that entrepreneurs and innovators don't have to worry about? We want entrepreneurs and innovators to focus on one thing, or at least one main thing, which is how can we quickly develop products and services and goods that are going to satisfy the needs of consumers? And again, that's especially important today when we have old ways of doing business in many sectors that are no longer profitable. That means that people are suffering, their incomes are falling. We need to try to get the economy to adapt as quickly as possible. And I think entrepreneurs and innovators are the way to go. But in order for them to be the most successful possible, you need to have the government not interfering. And I think that's a roadmap that not only exists for Georgia, but I think it's a roadmap that exists for every country in the world. Now, obviously, different countries will have different scores on these various measures from Fraser and Heritage. But the number one thing, whether we're talking about a coronavirus pandemic or whether we're talking about normal economic circumstances, people in government and outside observers who are trying to improve public policy should look where countries get bad scores and try to figure out where are the countries around the world that are good role models. And in the World Bank governance indicators, I think Switzerland's a great role model, but maybe some countries are doing a really bad job on fiscal policy or on regulation. Look at the places around the world that are being successful, copy them. The world is a laboratory, and that laboratory shows us that free markets and limited government are the best way to deliver mass prosperity for ordinary people. Thank you, Gia, for organizing this, and I'm glad to have the chance to participate.
Yeah, I would have one question for both of you, because I know you are in hurry, you need to leave. I don't know how quickly, but anyway. So during this pandemic period, there was a kind of trend to talk about it. Some big businesses would be withdrawing their industries from China. And it was kind of popular thing also in Georgia to talk that now those investments, those industries could move to Georgia, not the other countries, but to Georgia. So I answered with one of the articles that to have those industries and to have investments, the number one issue is to rise the productivity, because what I think is that China made a big step, but still maybe not more than 100 million people. I believe it could be even less than 50 million people who are really high productive. And that's what we see mostly, because we see computers, we see iPhones or other phones, smartphones, which are made in China, but this is maybe made by 50 million people, not the others are still behind. So I thought that if anybody wants to attract those investments or industries to Georgia or any other place, we need to think about how much is our labor and how good quality is our labor as well. So what would we say about this? Well, what is your opinion? Is it possible really that those investments go back or somewhere to the US or Europe or other places?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and try to give a quick answer to that. China, I think, faces some serious challenges because the economic reforms that they did in the latter part of the 20th century have stalled out. And there are concerns that President Xi is actually moving China back in the direction of cronyism and government-controlled industries. Not only that, but of course, there are issues involving trade and whether China is playing fair. And even if they are playing fair in some areas, President Trump in the United States is a protectionist. And so even if in areas where China might be playing fair, he doesn't really want trade. And of course, there are now human rights issues that have come to the forefront. And you have people around the world, not just in the US, but in other countries, they're worried about China maybe not playing fair in terms of respecting property rights and not stealing technology. So I think China is sort of being surrounded by all sorts of negative publicity right now, some of it deserved, maybe some of it not quite so deserved. And we are seeing businesses reassessing whether or not they want to be deeply involved with China. However, your question was, will Georgia be a potential beneficiary for that? Right now, at least, maybe John probably knows more since he's more in the business world and I'm just a policy wonk. But certainly just in terms of following the news, it seems like countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia might be reaping some of the benefits, at least in the short run. Now, can Georgia, with its limited population and maybe not quite as easy access to ocean shipping, can Georgia pick up some of that business? One would hope so, but you put your finger on it, Gia. It's not just the wages that workers in a country earn, it's how productive are they? And so when businesses are looking, where are we going to build factories? They're looking at supply chains, they're looking at transportation issues, they're looking, of course, at the quality of government policy, which of course is what I normally focus on. So whether Georgia can exploit what's happening in China, hopefully for the people of Georgia, you can, but there really are a lot of moving pieces to focus on.
Okay, thank you. John, maybe you also.
There are so many currents and countercurrents here with China and Georgia. First of all, it is not good news overall for the world, for the US, or for Georgia that China has taken this totalitarian turn in recent years. The harder it is for people to be creative, to be free, to innovate, the fewer innovations we're going to be able to come from China. That it'll hurt China most of all, but it'll also hurt the rest of the world because the rest of us are beneficiaries of these innovations in supply chain management and manufacturing and so forth. They enable us to buy goods at cheaper prices. That frees up capital for us to invest in other areas. The costs of goods and services will likely rise for the US and Georgia, things that originate in China. There may be some smaller opportunities, and I don't mean to discount them or dismiss them for Georgia as a result of this, and because so much of a country's opportunities are how it stands competitively relatively to other countries. And if Georgia can preserve free trade more effectively than any other country in its region or in the world, that would be a good thing that would work to its advantage. It may take time, but eventually companies in the US would see, hey, I can reliably, predictably, confidently outsource whatever I need to have manufactured or designed or what have you to Georgia. And that would be a good thing. So keeping trade barriers at bay, refusing to put them up either on the import side or the export side will help Georgia the most, I think.
Thank you very much. There is only one question so far, which is asking if you think that government funding of the startups is good or bad. Why it is bad? The original question is, as I understood from this, is why it is bad that government is funding the startups.
Well, I certainly have some thoughts on that as an entrepreneur myself. It's not a good idea, in my view, at all. First of all, the vast majority of startups are not successful. Even the best venture capital firms in Silicon Valley have a success, maybe 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10. And so there's a lot of money which goes down the tubes. And you're asking your taxpayers to absorb that risk. Two, with venture capital and private equity sources, the investors watch those investments very closely. And the fact that only 1 or 2 succeed is in spite of the fact that they're being watched and advised very closely. There's a great deal of accountability in the private sector. You don't have that accountability in the public sector. We know from history that lots of other issues other than just return on investment will intrude on decision making. We saw that with Solyndra, the solar engineering company, about probably 10 or 15 years ago now in the United States, which attracted over $500 million of capital from various agencies. None of that money was saved when Solyndra declared bankruptcy. In fact, the government's involvement was seen as a way of bailing out a failing startup by the preceding investors. So you can see how all the public choice concerns that have an opportunity to intrude when government gets involved in venture capital. By public choice, I mean issues irrelevant to public welfare that intrude on decision making. So those are one man's thoughts on the question of government-funded venture capital. Gia.
Thank you very much. And then if you want to add, or I don't know how soon you need to go, but we have 2 more speakers here. Maybe we move to more, or can it, please?
I'll just say something very short because John is the expert on that issue, and I think he gave a great answer. Politicians try to buy votes. Private sector investors try to create wealth. And so when you give government the power to fund startups or to allocate capital in any way whatsoever, politicians aren't going to allocate that money on the basis of what's going to, likely create jobs and growth and prosperity in the future. They're going to allocate it to their political supporters, to the people who might give them votes, to the people who might give them campaign contributions, or maybe they'll allocate the money in a way to preserve an incumbent industry when you really need new companies coming up with new ideas. So the track record of government as a venture capitalist is so weak that we should stay far, far away from that. And I do have to head into Washington by 1 o'clock, so I'm going to have to leave probably in about 10 minutes. So I just want to take this opportunity to again say thank you for organizing this, because it really is critical for good public policy to get these ideas right in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I also wrote recently about this. John, you want to go also, no?
I can stay for another 15 minutes.
Yeah, I was saying that recently I wrote about why I believe this is wrong, because I mean to fund not only startups but any kind of businesses, because if they want to have money, they could go to investors or to banks. But what they know is that this is the banks, they know this is too risky. And they would say that, no, it's too risky. We cannot give you credit for this type of projects, okay? then the government comes here and says, oh, okay, this is too risky, but we are here to be involved in the too risky businesses, of course, because this money is not really responsible money. We can spend irresponsibly and don't don't care about this. So that's the reality of this thing, that people think that government should fund the entrepreneurs instead of the financial organizations. And so now let's move to Pierre. Pierre,
Hello.
you hear me? Yes, please.
Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to see first friends online, and it's a pity that it could be the second year in a row where during which I don't visit Georgia. That would be really a pity. But it's not the end of the year yet, so maybe by December we'll get a chance to see you, to visit, to do something together.
Study some Georgian also.
Yeah, as you know, I'm very good at saying hello and thank you in Georgian. I'm not going to try now. I don't want to make a fool of myself. All right. As you said, I mentioned entrepreneurship and the crisis in a talk I gave earlier on in May, and in fact, what I would like to talk, and then we can discuss, is about what I hear all around myself here in France and probably in Europe. And this is exactly at the opposite. So I'm not going to talk about entrepreneurship. I'm going to talk essentially, because anyway, John and Dan did a good job at doing so. But I want to talk about the alternatives that our government in France and beyond that in the European Union and maybe in the US as well. I would be interested to know whether they hear the same thing. But they have a plan to get out of the crisis, and this plan, I think, is something we should really worry about. Now, let me first maybe tell a few words about that crisis, because this is a very atypical crisis. I mean, it's a crisis coming from lockdown. Okay, so the GDP is going down because we cannot go to work. It's it's not a war. It's not. It's just that. Okay, but still, of course, this creates a lot of problems, and some companies are in trouble. Some people have lost their jobs, and maybe some company will not survive. Whether, and I don't know if we want to discuss that, whether the state should help all of them, what would be a good way. I will say a few words about that later on. But still, even though some people are, of course, in trouble, it doesn't mean that it's a crisis that looks like the usual crisis. No factory have been demolished, so know-how is still there. Actually, people have a lot of savings because they have not consumed a lot during the last 3 months. So the question is, what should we do in that situation? I should add on top of that, and we have at least one businessman on the panel, that there is still a lot of uncertainty, of course, regarding whether the virus will come back, whether there will be a second wave, and business usually don't like uncertainty too much. I mean, so this is a situation. Now, what our government are offering to us now? It is not entrepreneurship. Basically, they want to replay what they have been playing already in 2008, 2009, 2010, and for the last 20 years, basically, with their public finance policy, their quantitative easing, and so on and so forth. They would like to play, by the same rule, basically. And even worse, and this, at least in France, is very loud. You have all that talk about we are now entering a new world. The world will never be the same. And of course, all the the green parties, they just enjoy that now. It's let's jump on the opportunity. We need to consume near our country. We need to be independent in all areas, including food, of course, electricity, pharmaceutical, and so on and so forth. So this is what we hear. So basically, the government wants to play by the same rules they've been playing the last 20 years, maybe even worse, because they want to push the changes, farther towards a new world. And now the numbers, it's a bit difficult to comment on the numbers at that point, because the situation is, of course, really specific. But let's just take the case of France. Our public deficit should be above 11% this year. It used to be 3% last year. Public debt will jump from some 98% of GDP to probably around 120% of GDP. And at the European level, it's just about the same. As you probably heard, the EU will borrow some 750 billion euros, and around the plan, which has three directions. One of them is Green Deal. So there is a new Green Deal, of course. The other one is digitization, and the third one will be resilience of our economy. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I hear again and again in France, but also coming from Brussels, even coming from Germany, which surprisingly agreed with Macron on such a big spending plan at the level of Europe. So basically what is chosen is a kind of macroeconomic approach to the crisis, maybe even worse. So people, for instance, they say, look, GDP went down by 12%. Of course, it went down by 12%. We were locked down. In and of itself, that those data don't tell us anything deep about the situation. So they follow that macroeconomic approach along some Keynesian lines. That's what they always do. And basically, they want to rely on some kind of expert to tell us where we should spend all that huge amount of money that we are borrowing right now. Now, this didn't work in the past. As I said, that's what they have been basically doing for the last 20 years, except that they want to do it at even a larger scale. And it will not work this time either. Okay? So that's why I think it's our job to stress the fact that the solution is exactly in the opposite direction. Instead of taking this macro state expert approach, we should move towards a micro, down to the earth entrepreneurial approach to the crisis. Now, there was that question, Gia, that you put to John and Dan, and that illustrates perfectly why a macro approach will not work, and while a voluntary approach, people investing their own money will work. Okay, we know how the question was about startup, but take the question about the companies which have some problem of liquidity, or for some of them insolvency. Who is in the best position to decide whether this is really just a direct consequence of the crisis, but the company is sound and should be able to take off again as soon as things get back to normal? Or if on the contrary, that company was already very weak before the crisis, and the owner of the company showed their inability to rebound, to find new ideas. So who is in the best position to make that choice? As John said, I think those are venture capitalists, those are private equity managers. This could even be eventually the local bank if it is a small business, and they are in the best position to make those choices and to make sure that the money is provided to those who are in need for and who are able to create wealth. Now, instead of that, in France, like in many other countries, I think, the path chosen so far is that the state is giving the same, basically the same amount of money, the same rule. It's a rule based on the takeover of the company, the turnover of the company, I'm sorry. And it's applied across the border via what we call our public investment bank. Because we do have this kind of thing in France instead of venture capitalists most of the time. All right, so you see through that example of how do we provide finance to companies which are able to create wealth in the present situation, we see that as usual, as always, the main problem is a problem of who has the relevant knowledge to make the decision, okay? And the relevant knowledge is at the level of the people who are in the business, who are putting their own money, who are responsible, accountable, as John said earlier, for what they decide, okay? If you manage the money of others, if it's some people in Brussels that are going to allocate the 700 billion euros who have 25 countries, this is going to be a waste of money. Now, I mean, so this is really my basic point, and then we can discuss things further. But it's really everywhere. Look, through the crisis, some countries, and France is one of them, realized that our healthcare system might not be the most efficient in the world, okay? So there is a crisis in the healthcare system, and now doctors are demonstrating in the street. They want an extra 1,000 per month, and so on and so forth. So here again, we have the two solutions. Either we go for a new state plan for the healthcare system, and this will be, of course, going in the wrong direction. French healthcare system is very inefficient, or at least is inefficient in terms of cost benefit, because it's totally centralized. It's one of the most centralized in the world. Okay, so what we need is to reintroduce at least some quantity of entrepreneurship in that healthcare system if we want better choice to be made, if we want that laboratory. I like to use that instead of having everyone following the same policy, let the lab, open the lab, let people manage their hospital as they wish it's the best solution. And maybe, by the way, the best solution is not the same in a small hospital, in a big hospital, in the urban hospital, in the countryside hospital, and so on and so forth. So in almost every field, and I could go on, I could go on, the local knowledge, the knowledge of time and place, as we like to say, is really what you should look for. And this never comes from the government, always comes from the bottom. Now, let me, and then we will discuss something. Let me share another thing which is starting to worry me. We talked a lot about finance so far. It's the fact that we are now getting used in country like France to that world where interest rate is close to zero. People are wondering where all those billions come from. They don't understand. And what is the result of that? The result of that, I'm afraid, is that a lot of the money will go where? As I said, there have been a lot of saving in France, a huge amount of saving for the last 3 months. But this saving will go in real estate and construction because people don't trust all those things. They want the real thing. They won't go towards financing businesses, financing things like that. So this is another, I think, very sad consequences of this macro approach to our problem, to the crisis. And we should speak loud because this new monetary theory, all this garbage that we are fed with lately, I think will have very bad long-term consequences. And because I'm French, let me end up with Bastia. What is seen and what is unseen. Maybe what we see now is that everyone gets paid by the state, even though they get unemployed, even though they get just a temporary job. The French state is very generous. They are paying for all of that. They are giving money to all the companies that are in distress. But to act in such an irresponsible way is probably to open, the future to very bad or very, very sad consequences. And the interesting things, again, and I close with that, is that we are just coming out of 20 years of such policies that didn't work. I mean, since 2008, they threw a huge amount of money in the economy for very, very poor results.
Thank you, Pierre. We should give some time to Dan and John before they leave, maybe, because I understand they need to leave very, very soon. So to have final comments, John.
Well, I really like what Pierre and Dan have said on this and related topics. Just one additional thought on the healthcare system, as Pierre was talking about it. I think it's a mistake to use the phrase healthcare system. That, and of course it's used universally in all of the press by everybody. But it's the wrong way to think about healthcare. I prefer the phrase ecosystem, the healthcare ecosystem, and that reminds us that it's a constantly evolving, dynamic, unpredictable, unmanageable system, as it should be if healthcare is going to progress and get better for all of us. To me, system suggests something that's controlled from the top down, and once we adopt that mindset, we've lost the game, in my view. But rather viewing it as an ecosystem, we recognize that innovations and new procedures and instruments and technologies emerge from the bottom up and are adopted by other people throughout the ecosystem. For Georgia and healthcare, I would say don't look to the United States as a role model to emulate with our, with the systems that we have in place. In fact, I'm not sure which country to look at as a role model, as the best role model, but what I would suggest looking at as a role model is cosmetic dentistry and cosmetic dermatology. These are relatively unregulated sectors of healthcare. And as a result, prices have plummeted, costs have plummeted because there's real competition in this sector, in these sectors, unlike the monopolistic structure that we see in mainstream healthcare. But if Georgia could adopt the same kind of freedom and free market and market signaling and competition that we enjoy in cosmetic dentistry and dermatology in the United States for its entire healthcare ecosystem, that would be a big one for Georgia and for the world, because Georgia would be setting such a great example for the rest of the world, in my view.
Thank you, John. And Dan, you want to say something before you leave also, please?
Well, obviously, I agree with everything Pierre said. For that matter, I agree with everything John said. So maybe what I'll do with my final comments is one of the questions from Manuel in Argentina was about his country's deterioration. And I'm not sure I have a good answer. Indeed, this is perhaps me just venting a frustration. When you look at the world as a laboratory, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, To me, that laboratory tells us a very clear lesson. Look at the prosperity of South Korea compared to North Korea. Look at how West Germany outperformed East Germany before reunification. You look at how some states in the United States, like Florida and Texas, with no income tax, grow faster than high tax states like New York and California. Or an example for Pierre, Switzerland has a much smaller burden of government than France, and Switzerland is richer. And you know, and likewise for Manuel in Argentina, look at how Chile is outperforming Argentina. So all I would say is we know from real world evidence what works. The very frustrating thing that constantly that I can't come up with a good answer for is why are we sometimes unable to convince politicians that this real world evidence should give us a roadmap of the policies to follow? I've been trying to figure that answer out for 40 years. Hopefully I'll figure it out before too much longer because I'm getting older every day. So thank you again for the chance to be with you.
Thank you very much, both John and
Slowly.
Dan. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a thrill to be with you.
Yeah.
See you.
Then we should move to Philippe. Philippe is, I think we met once or twice because I made many presentations at the Office of Americans for Tax Reforms. He represents this office and also, as I understand, also the part which is looking for the freedom of property rights, correct?
Yeah, thanks, Gia, and thank you for the New Economic School for having this timely webinar.
There are
Entrepreneurs.
so many issues connected with your office work. So, yeah, I need to say one important thing about the office, that this is maybe one of the very few practical offices which is having every Wednesday the meetings with lots of different institutions and politicians, and everybody could be there to discuss the policy in the US. And there are people coming from entire US, from every state of the US. This is very interesting practice. For me, it was a very interesting and it was a pleasure to be there every time I was taking part. So please, Philippe.
Thanks, Gia. So I want to say that entrepreneurs are the special resources in society that are able to marry innovation with opportunity and technology to create solutions to challenges we face in society. And COVID-19 is one challenge that we're all facing right now. So what the other speakers have already mentioned is we need to make sure we have an environment and the economy that cultivates entrepreneurship. And some of those qualities in that environment have to be free from burdensome regulations that deter people from great ideas from entering the marketplace. There needs to be an appreciation for business structures that limit liability and reduce risk. There needs to be access to consumers, access to financial markets, and of course, access to trade. And during all our lockdowns, many of those have been limited greatly. So Property Rights Alliance, which is part of Americans for Tax Reform, we look at two essential freedoms that allow those ingredients to happen on their own when they're protected. That's the freedom to trade and the freedom to own property and exchange property. And so over the years, we've created two indexes that can measure how countries are protecting these freedoms. That's the International Property Rights Index. So 2020 will be our 13th year of having the International Property Rights Index. And we also last year released the International Trade Barrier Index. The Trade Barrier Index looks at the three most direct forms of trade barriers. Those are tariffs, non-tariff measures, and services restrictions. There's 3 or 4 indicators in each category. The fourth component is facilitation, which looks at logistics performance, of course, property rights, membership in regional trade agreements, which reduce barriers and streamline rules. And there's also digital trade restrictions in that. The Property Rights Index, which is plays a large role, especially in responding to COVID-19, it has three pillars: the legal and political environment. That includes political stability, control of corruption, judicial independence, many of the things Dan Mitchell already pointed out. It also looks at the Physical Property Rights Index. Are private property rights protected? Do people have access to loans? Do they have access to registering property without costly delays? And then the third component is in intellectual property, where people look at, the index looks at, are patents protected, and are copyrights protected, which is especially prominent when we look at responding to COVID-19. So we do different correlations with our indexes to see how they relate to other measures of economic and social well-being. There's one index called the Entrepreneurship Index. So they both have which looks at the social attitudes. It's a social survey towards risk, towards business. And it also looks at the access to different technologies. So the Trade Bureau Index has a 0.67 robust correlation to the entrepreneurship environment. The United States is #1 on that index. And then the Property Rights Index, though, it's really the strongest relationship with any other indicator. It has a 0.90 correlation with the Entrepreneurship Index. And it's the intellectual property component has a 0.83 Pearson correlation with entrepreneurship. So what does that mean when we talk about COVID-19 in the real world? Well, what we've been doing at ATR, we've been tracking how the United States has led a response to COVID-19 by deregulation. So to date, we've tracked 727 regulations waived, which have allowed businesses, especially entrepreneurs, to switch up their assembly lines and their markets to produce protective equipment. Distilleries have been able to make, because of those waiving of regulations, they've been able to make hand sanitizers. They've been able to transport hand sanitizer, market it. Dan already mentioned we've been able to do e-health and telehealth. These regulations have allowed manufacturers to make face shields, where before there was a ton of regulations that limited how people could make medical equipment and different types of checks they had to go through before going to the market. But more importantly, as we talk about COVID-19, is where is the pharmaceutical sector, which is really where the solution is, that's creating the vaccines and creating treatments, and how do these cultivate, where are entrepreneurs in this sector? So the Biomed Tracker tracks the unique compounds that are being tested and developed to treat COVID-19. And overall in the world, there's 615 unique compounds in development. 161 are vaccines, 183 are antivirals, and 271 are treatments. But the US is really the headquarters of the companies that are doing the R&D for 313 of those. So over half of all anything related to COVID-19 is done by US-based companies. And the next country after the United States is China, which of course these are more state-owned companies or state universities, but they're home to companies that are only researching 39 of those compounds. So it goes from 313 in the United States to 39 in China. And then that's followed by Germany, the UK, Canada, Japan, and France. So what's going on in the United States that allows so much entrepreneurship and innovation in the pharmaceutical sector, where 90% of what's being researched comes from the private sector, and 70% of R&D for COVID-19 comes from small businesses. So where are these, we always hear about these large pharmaceutical companies, and who are these small businesses that are really doing a lot of this research? In the 1980s, the United States passed the Bayh-Dole Act that allowed universities that receive grants to own the intellectual property and market it when they are researching for grants for the National Institutes of Health, for instance. So a lot of university systems, like the University of California, they've developed whole offices that are just dedicated to patenting products that are developed through research. They go out and market it, they license it. And so it's a big moneymaker. They've attracted top talent. They have 2 parking lots dedicated at Berkeley, dedicated to Nobel Prize winners. One of their institutes, the Institutes of Genomic Research, developed one of the saliva tests for COVID-19. And where a lot of these small businesses come from is a lot of PhD students. They graduate and they've been through a discovery phase through research of some medical malady, or they're professors part-time, or they resign. They think of a product that they have an idea for something they've been researching. And then they go out and they start their small businesses to take something from discovery to preclinical trials, and then probably phase 1 or phase 2. And eventually they get acquired when they can produce something that shows a lot of promise. So this is, I think, the heart of how we solve COVID-19, the backbone, which we'll see when we develop a vaccine in only a few more months, has been these entrepreneurs in the pharmaceutical sector that have relied on private property rights. Thank you, Gia.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I don't see any questions, but my question to Philippe would be this way: that how do you think what could be what kind of efforts could be supportive to the innovation in the direction of inventing now this medicine for the coronavirus? Is there any kind of chance to make it quicker? Because what we see is that because of this coronavirus, for instance, in our country of Georgia, everything was locked down, and we have maybe one of the best situation with the coronavirus, as the number of infected is below 1,000, and only 5 people, as I remember, died. But on the other hand, our economy is almost completely destroyed. And if you go to some places like malls, you see emptiness, let's say. So that means
Right.
that
Well,
yeah,
so Dan already talked
everything
about.
depends on now on the vaccine, as I understand.
So Dan already talked about using the different countries as laboratories, and clearly what has differentiated the United States has been our deregulation effort. So I mentioned already 727 rules have been waived to allow entrepreneurs to respond to COVID-19. And we're going to be working really hard. If waiving those rules worked, then why would we put them back, especially for things like telehealth? But the other striking difference in the United States has been, like I mentioned, our pharmaceutical sector. So how can other countries copy that and choose to protect intellectual property rights for this sector, which takes billions of dollars for investment, and it has to be long-term. Usually it takes about 12 years for a drug to go from discovery to the market. And we've been doing that. We're going to do that in 18 months, it looks like, for COVID-19 vaccine. We'll have several vaccines. So I think in a couple months, we'll see that the products of the United States will be the solution for the rest of the world. And why are there only so few countries developing these IP-intensive products? It's because they don't protect intellectual property rights enough. And that's what's clear in our IP index. And it's what will be the clear result when we have a solution to COVID-19, is that all the vaccines are either going to come from the United States and probably a couple from Oxford.
Thank you. So maybe Pierre wants to add something to this.
I don't know. I don't know. I would like to challenge maybe a bit, Philip. I mean, I've always thought that the question of intellectual property rights is at least a complicated one. I mean, a difficult one, and you were entirely linking entrepreneurship in the development of remedies and vaccine to intellectual property rights. and of course, we can even maybe in the coming months come up with some correlation between the two. But with intellectual property rights, the big question is always a counterfactual. I mean, all those young PhD students, will they be no other ways to be, to make money and to be proud of themselves if there was no intellectual property right, there was no patent and so on and so forth. I think this is the key question with intellectual property rights. Which is the reason why I'm always, and I know you work, by the way, and I use your work with my students, and I've been using the International Property Right Index for years, but still, you do have a problem there of, I'm not sure that the statistics will be enough in proving the power of intellectual property rights. If you look at the map in the world, of course, the country, the most advanced country in terms of science are also countries where you have intellectual property rights. So, it's a kind of vicious circle. Of course, the vaccine is more likely to come from there, but because they are the most advanced. So to what extent they are the most advanced because of intellectual property rights, this is a big question. So, you are more knowledgeable than me, Philip, on those topics. So what could you add to convince a skeptical like me, who is always, in music, for instance, we were able to find an alternative to the copyrights. We know there are other ways to make a good living with your music without the copyrights, and in other fields as well. So what about that? And we also know that some key medication were found in the past without the protection of patents. So what would you add to try to convince a skeptical like me?
I think certainly there's no magic pill. Having the strongest intellectual property rights, they are not going to solve every problem in society. You're presenting a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, which comes first. The data from our index actually shows that the legal and political environment improves first before other measures of private property rights or intellectual property rights. So I would say focus there, but also the results, I think, speak for themselves, not just in terms of protection of IP, but in the products that come out as a result and the marketing of them. It's clear that we're going to have 3 or 4 vaccines, and they're going to come from US-based companies doing US-based R&D. Clinical trials take place for each of those all around the world because there's so many regulations on how drugs can be improved in different countries. But I don't think I don't think you've presented a trade-off in having intellectual property or not having intellectual property. Certainly there are countries that don't have intellectual property rights, but they don't show those innovations that people often think that.
Yeah, but as you know, France is very strong in IP, for instance.
Right.
Even in your ranking, we are among the top 10, I think, or I don't remember the data, but we're pretty good in intellectual property. Plus, we do have the same system at the university where, and it's like in the US, university now make a job of patenting some of the things coming out of their labs. Still, we seems to be more efficient. So, my point is that there are probably more, and there are probably some entrepreneurial spirits, and I fully agree with you, and it's probably stronger in the US than in France. But what I'm saying is that, the link with the intellectual property rights is probably more complex. As you know, Switzerland has, pretty good pharmaceutical. So if the vaccine does not come from there, maybe for some other reasons. It's that was my point. It's I'm not saying that the US system, maybe as of today, is not the most efficient in terms of pharmaceutical developments. I'm just saying that there is probably more than just IP to the story.
Right. I think a lot of pharmaceuticals research takes place within a network of business activity, university activity, networks between individuals, also the legal and political environment we already mentioned. But for instance, countries like Georgia, which is 70th on the International Property Rights Index, I don't see why Georgia shouldn't also promote intellectual property as well as addressing rule of law and political stability and jurisprudence at the same time.
Yeah, in fact, we are now kind of association member with the European Union, and it obliges us. We have deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, and it obliges Georgia to have some measures to restrict the intellectual property rights. On the other hand, the people are too poor. This is one of the reasons why there are still many violations of the intellectual property rights. Because if Georgians were much more wealthier, they would be agreeing to buy the things instead of stealing them. Like this is like computer programs, Windows, or especially Office programs, for instance. But on the other hand, we are mostly users of those, not the creators of the fake Windows or fake Office programs. They are mostly coming from China or Russia in reality, because Georgia is too small market for making such things, breaking in Georgia.
Yeah, as long as we're talking about intellectual property and development, I think we need to mention, I mean, the celebrity is always patents and inventing the next huge company like that can make something like a computer that everybody uses. But one of the unsung heroes of intellectual property is trademarks, which allow small businesses to brand their businesses, have a name, and then have a value, a reputation in the marketplace. We have pretty much every business in the United States now is branded. In the 70s, there weren't. You would just go to a gym, it'd just be called a gym. Now you can go to 24-Hour Fitness, Planet Fitness, and that has a value to the consumer. Trademark industries are the largest employers in the United States and around the world. The trademark businesses pay people higher wages because they can afford to, because they have that value of intellectual property that the unbranded businesses don't. And I think that one of the, in countries that are like exemplars on how to protect intellectual property, not do they only have programs in universities that tell people how you can patent stuff, but they also go around and tell different small business owners the value of branding and how to protect your trademarks and trade. So I think that deserves more attention in Georgia than probably protecting the next hit music on the charts over there.
There were some cases in that direction. For instance, the entire former Soviet Union was falsifying Georgian wines. Not only Soviets, but also Bulgaria was. Once Krasen Stanchev was really surprised with that. We were in Vilnius and he found Georgian wines made in Bulgaria. So it was fake wine, of course, nothing to do with the Georgian wines. But as the Georgian names were more popular in the Soviet Union and other places of socialist camp, let's say, they were falsifying the Georgian wines, and it's a huge thing. For instance, for Georgia to keep this
tremendous value in that. And if you think of the earliest trademark protections, actually came from the UK, and it was a small distillery wanted to protect its trademark for its beer. And but once those protections are in place, there's so many artisan industries for wine and other goods in Europe. But once those were protected in the 1800s, they could not only be free from false products, but they could outsource and increase manufacturing in different countries, different parts of the region, where before, to get the real product, you'd have to go to the one guy's business to get the real product. But when trademarks are protected, you could expand outside your country because you control who's using your brand and make sure it's the quality that you want.
Yeah, there was another famous case with the Georgian mineral water. Pierre knows it's Borjomi, you remember?
Borjomi.
Hangover drink. So this is mostly popular in Russia, although this was discovered by Russian Tsar in 19th century. He had even his residence there in that place. But then they were fighting for, because the Borjomi water was falsified, as they were saying, in every family in Russia. So they were adding some gas and selling out in the street. But now this company made a huge effort to fight this falsification, and they achieved something that now this company belongs to Russians anyway. But it was the fight. But you can imagine this is a big company. If you are a small company, which is 5,000 bottles of wine, then it comes with such a thing that there are maybe 20% good producers, but there are 80% which are looking for some wrong customers, let's say in Russia, for instance, who don't care about what they are drinking. So and then these wrong customers are playing a bad role, that they are together with Georgian producers of bad wines, let's say, low quality wines. They are making the image of Georgian wine very bad. So these small companies which are making good wine, they are in the tremendous fight that they want to move forward, but it's not that easy. Maybe this is,
yeah.
How can you help us? Pierre, please.
Yeah, let me just really insist and say that I fully agree with Philip on this. I mean, protecting trademark is something really essential. And surely, I mean, even though this is all under the basket, I mean, the basket of intellectual property right, I think those protections are really of a different nature than patents and copyright. And why precisely, and that might be a way to get back to our main theme, because trademarks help us to convey knowledge and give incentive for people to invest in trust and to invest in quality. So this is indeed a very valuable tool. And I think that, Georgia, surely, and again, I think that Philip is totally right, should make that a priority, that if some people invest in quality, in trust, the brand convey knowledge to the people, and this should be protected. This is really essential. As soon as the market opened a little bit, of course, in a closed village, you don't need trademark because people have that type of knowledge. But as markets become more complex and division of labor is much higher, trademark and branding is really something essential.
Yeah, it comes with not only about wine, but for instance, with the Georgian dishes, some of our neighbors, let's say, they are pretending this is not Georgian, but like khachapuri, for instance, or khinkali, Pierre knows these Georgian dishes. So some of our neighbors, not some, but one of the neighbors is very active to pretend that they are the the source of the dish. But anyway, we do some job on this, and but I think that this protecting of intellectual property rights, first of all, as I said, very important is to understand that we have very poor people, and when they are poor, they are not really easy to pay for everything like computer programs or the music or the videos. So in the black market here, you can buy one DVD which contains maybe 20 films and watch at home without problems. But why? Because it's so cheap, first of all. And what is the alternative? You need to pay maybe 100 times more to the alternative. So that's the real thing. But on the other hand, of course, it must be useful when you are talking about the trademark. We need to work on this with our entrepreneurs. Maybe we can join our efforts to teach them why for them it's so important to keep their trademark or the brand name or etc. etc. But there was also our common case when it came to the plain packaging. Uh, Lorenzo was in Georgia. We went to some companies to help them in this area of Pierre, plain packaging. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the case is absolutely wrong. We went to them and said that sometimes you are not easy to talk loud about these things because you don't need political bias on this or anything. But we are here and we will be supporting you because it's not only about intellectual property rights. It's my business what I write on this, and it's a business of the customer if they like the cigarettes without signs or the text or with text. So they are violating lots of things. The freedom of choice and the freedom of my vision, etc. Maybe I like to write something on my package and sell it. It's not the business of anybody. But the wrong side of this is that they prefer to work and they are much easier, much happier to work with the government. And where it is going, this situation, nowhere. They are cutting, regulating, and one day there will be already nothing to fight anymore. So not only we are in that kind of frustration, but these businesses must come to us and tell us, let's fight together. And we are ready for fighting for this. But in that case, it did not work, unfortunately.
I believe Georgia, you're frozen a little bit. Georgia, I think, delayed the implementation a little bit, but I'm worried that the lesson that governments learned from the whole process is that as long as there's a business that isn't in line with the health policy or environmental policy, that they are free to take this property, these trademarks away without repercussions and without compensating those companies that they remove them from. And recently the WTO Appellate Board, I believe it's their last case they're going to rule on, ruled in favor of Australia. But it will be the poster case for where the WTO Appellate Board went wrong, because many of these judges, they had to pretend to be scientists, social scientists, political scientists to agree that plain packaging was a justified measure to restrict trade. So we'll see what happens to that as we go forward on trade.
I think in our case is in Georgia, I mean, the plain packaging was maybe not pushed but offered by, for instance, European Union, and sometimes these kind of offers are also coinciding with some other things, like if you implement this, So then you can get a grant of 20 million for something, including of implementation of the plain packaging. And the governments are so corrupted with these kind of things that they think that, okay, if when it comes from the European Union, why should we oppose to this? We will also say that we are so pro-European that we are accepting these ideas which are coming from the EU. But on the other side, which is not seen, as Pierre was saying, and Frederic Bastiat said this 200 years ago, almost, so that they don't see the consequences of these kind of things. And unfortunately, we are one of the top 11 countries which already passed this legislation, although it was prolonged the implementation. So, but what I'm pushing here is not that government, we should fight government. We should cooperate with these companies, which are unfortunately preferring to cooperate with the government. That's a problem. And Pierre wanted to say something.
No.
So anyway, there are no more questions. If you want to add something, please. Just my vision was that the entrepreneurs, decentralized people who are looking for information, who are seeing what are the demands, who are risking their own resources, they are the only solution to the crisis. That's what I implied with this session, and I'm very happy that the panel was very good for to discuss this. And if we don't have anything to add, or you want to add something here?
Well, just in the way of a conclusion, at least for me, and then,
Please.
As Dan was saying, the difficulty is to get our message through. I honestly think that our viewpoint on the role of entrepreneurship is very objective and belongs to science, but still we have a hard time to get that through. Now, as an example, and give me just that quote. I often like to quote. I think it was a minister of economy in France, then was a minister in Brussels or a member of the commission, and he used to say this. He said, that was back in the 90s, and he says, "We are ambitious." We meant the social government that were prevailing over Europe at that time. We are ambitious, and because we are ambitious, we want regulation. While those who choose laissez-faire are those who have abandoned any hope of making a better world. Now, this is how the brain of that guy was framed. If you are ambitious, you want to regulate through the state, you want to organize a new Green Deal or whatever, because we are ambitious, okay? If you leave it to people and to entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is just an expression of freedom. I'm free after all to do what I want to do with my time and my money and my friends, okay? If you leave it to people, it means that you give up any hope of improving the world. I think the truth is exactly at the opposite, and our challenge is to try to convince people that it is so, that entrusting things to the state is not being ambitious, it's just the opposite. And the last thing I wanted to close with, but unfortunately I don't remember exactly the way he put it, and he put it in a very nice way, is a quote from, it was on Café Hayek from Don Boudreaux, which says something about the liberal wants to live in a world of adults. We want adult people responsible for what they do, people who take responsibility for their mistakes, but also, of course, people who can grab the benefit of their work and effort. And So let's hope that crisis will make us more adults. And let's hope this is not just wishful thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. And I will add only one thing because there are so many things to add. But recently I found the old book of public finance, which was published in Georgia in 1928. This was after the revolution, etc. But the author was the German guy. I applied to some to our friends to make a new printing of this book after 100 years. But that German economist, he was writing about the many things, but among them public debt. And he was saying that if the current generation is refusing to tax themselves to pay for the immediate needs of the government, then they are pushing the government to get the loans, get the funding from the private sector and pay. And who will be paying? The next generation, who are not even maybe even born now. But this is like very bad behavior, he was saying that, because those young people would be limited in their abilities to do something, because they will be having much higher burden of the government spending on their businesses, and this will push them to go out from the country and go somewhere else. This was 100 years ago. Can you believe this? This guy was understanding very well. There is also a passage about how Russia lost the First World War, because it inflated the money, and Russia was gold currency until 1915. Can you imagine gold currency? And I calculated how much gold was in circulation, and I found amazing fact that even now Russia has money in circulation less than 100 years ago. Can you imagine? The economy is smaller even now after 100 years than that time when they had gold currency. And he says, the German author, that the paper money is very dishonest thing, and that's a proof that now you see what happened with Russia and with Germany, etc. Why they lost? Because they printed the money. Okay, thank you very much, Philippe, Pierre. It was great to be with you. Maybe Tamta wants to say something. Tamta, you were cut because of some.
Hopefully I won't be disconnected again. Many thanks to the conference organizers, excellent speakers for interesting discussion and remarks, which is important for Georgia. And next year, I'm sure that the world will be already relaxed and we will meet again at our university, and we'll be happy to host the Free Market Roadshow again, as always, with active topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tamta, and thanks to the Austrian Economic Center, to Victoria, to Martin, to Brit, Barbara, I don't want to, Kai or Kai, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.